Hey everybody, Mr. Maupin coming back at you again. This is another AP Gov video focusing in on topic 2.12, kind of introducing us to the bureaucracy. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at two very important sets of relationships that kind of define the bureaucracy's role with others outside of the bureaucracy. And that's going to be taking a look at iron triangles and issue networks. Now, with regards to iron triangles are a more traditional type of relationship that involves bureaucratic agencies. Many political scientists would say that it's maybe a little bit simplistic to kind of describe the relationship today, especially in comparison to issue networks, which we'll get to in a moment. But that being said, iron triangles are still an important concept to know, so let's kind of get to it. When we talk about iron triangles, as the name implies, triangles, there are 3 points to this relationship. Iron triangles are made up of a relationship made up between interest groups, related congressional committees, and related bureaucratic agencies. And of course, the term iron being applied to it shows the strength and the tightness of this relationship. That, in other words, they kind of form this bond, if you will, in terms of their reliance on one another. So let me show you this, kind of a basic example of a template for an iron triangle. Once again, you see the 3 points of the triangle here. You got an interest group, you got Congress or congressional committee, and then you got the bureaucracy, some type of related bureaucratic agency. And take a look at how each of these points on the triangle relate to one another, and they tighten that one point to the other 2 points. So for example, interest groups obviously want legislation that is favorable for them from Congress. In return, interest groups are more likely to provide electoral support for members of Congress that are candidates seeking re-election. So in other words, you give the interest group the policies they want, and then you give the political support. Could be campaign donations, could be an endorsement, whatever that the member of Congress running for re-election would want from an interest group. Now, if you're looking at the side connecting Congress to a bureaucratic agency, well, remember, Congress has the purse strings. They are the ones that are responsible for the funding of a bureaucratic agency. And the basic general rule is the more money you have, the more power you have. So bureaucratic agencies are always looking for more funding from Congress and looking for more, to some degree, independence in how they can enforce the law. So note, in exchange for maybe getting more funding from a related congressional committee, then that bureaucratic agency is probably going to be enforcing those laws in a way that is more in line with what that related congressional committee that funds them would want. And then lastly, if we're looking at the side that's connecting interest groups and bureaucratic agencies, remember, once again, they're related to one another. Interest groups, just like with Congress, they want bureaucratic agencies that are related to them to enforce policies in a way that they like, that are favorable for them. In return, interest groups will show support for bureaucratic agencies. For example, if they are testifying in a congressional hearing that might be affecting the fate of a bureaucratic agency, the funding of it, etc., etc. So as you can see, it's kind of a three-sided symbiotic relationship that exists between these 3 points that all have a major impact on policy. Now that's just a generic look at it. If you were to put it and make it a little bit more realistic, to make it like more of a real example, think of one that would be focusing in on education policy. For example, if you were looking at it from a congressional committee perspective, education policy emanates from bills that come from the Senate HELP Committee. HELP is an acronym for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So any kind of education bill has got to come out of that Senate committee. Now, if that bill ends up becoming law, well, then that law that had come out of that HELP Committee is then going to be sent over to the Department of Education to be enforced. And of course, the laws that are created by the Senate HELP Committee and are enforced by the Department of Education are going to be affecting, for example, members of the NEA. The NEA is the National Educators Association, a major union representing teachers across the country. In other words, an example of an interest group. So to use that template once again to kind of show the relationship, if you're the NEA, you want laws that are favorable to teachers. If you are getting those policies that you want, then the NEA would be more likely to endorse candidates for office that are currently members of that Senate Help Committee, could provide donations, etc. If you are the Department of Education, you want broad funding and broad leeway of discretion from the Senate Help Committee in terms of how much money they give you and how narrowly or how strictly they or explicitly write the legislation that might affect how you enforce it. And then, once again, lastly, if you are the NEA, you want the Department of Education to enforce education laws in a way that are favorable to teachers, because that's who you represent in the NEA. And in exchange, the Department of Education is going to want, favorable feedback from the NEA if, for example, the Senate Help Committee is doing some type of oversight over that committee that might affect their funding and jurisdiction and stuff like that. So iron triangles are a traditional tight relationship between interest groups, related congressional committees, and related bureaucratic agencies that have a major impact on policy in the federal government. But as I said earlier, many political scientists would argue that iron triangles are more of a kind of a simplistic kind of relationship that exists out there, that if you really wanted to make it more realistic of the impact that policy has on various aspects of American governing society, you have to look at issue groups, or issue networks. Issue networks are much more complex groups that have a broader and more sophisticated impact on federal government policy, in particular the implementation of that policy. It transcends that traditional iron triangle relationship of just 3 points. It goes much deeper. So let me show you this example right here, focusing in once again on education. As it's kind of defined here, issue networks go beyond congressional committees, they go beyond interest groups, they go beyond bureaucratic agencies, but they also bring in, for example, aspects of the media. They bring in aspects of university scholars, think tanks, etc., etc. So, for example, if you're looking at policy matters dealing with education funding, public education funding, it's not going to be just the Department of Education. It's not going to be just the, in this case, Senate Help Committee or House Committee on Education and Workforce, and it's not going to be just the NEA up here. It's going to be taking a look at other types of groups. For example, the National School Board Association. That's an interest group that represents school boards. But you've also got think tanks like, Rethinking Schools, for example, and, state departments of education that are also going to be playing a role. Because remember, public education is really implemented at the state level at the end of the day. So understand that the way policy is created and therefore implemented can be arguably much more complex than just a simple three-sided relationship that's kind of symbiotic in nature. So anyhow, just keep in mind the similarities and differences between iron triangles and issue networks. We'll see you next time.